During this time, there were basically three types of Chinese women immigrants going to the United States. As noted in the slide there, well, you had prostitutes, which were the majority of the women coming from China to the U.S. But you also had indentured servants. These were usually young women working as domestic workers for the households of Chinese families in the West, merchant families, I should say. They're known as the Mui Chai. And then, thirdly, you had the wives and daughters of the merchants. So, the merchant families, as I mentioned, were one of the only families that were around, and they're very small in number during this time. So, the first type, the significant numbers of Chinese female immigrants during the 1800s were indeed poor girls who had been sold into prostitution in China. Now, by the way, one thing that's pretty accurate about the Hollywood Western movies about the American West, well, there were indeed the presence of prostitutes in the West. You always see brothel scenes in those westerns, right? And quite a few women, and here I'm talking about American women, not just Asian, out of sheer economic necessity, really, they decided to journey to the American West to work as prostitutes. There's a high gender imbalance there at the time. And there were also some men who had easy access to wealth during the early years of the gold rush. And really, there was just general lack of, or I should say, less social and moral restraints compared to the East. Okay, so uh, this was a common a thing that's happening in the West. In other words, so Chinese prostitutes who came to the West, well, they were almost always imported there as unfree women. Okay, virtually enslaved. Okay, indentured and enslaved. So we're talking about sex slave traffic here. Most were kidnapped, lured, tricked, or actually sold by their poor parents in China. And by the way, back then, girls were deemed much less desirable than boys in many traditional Chinese families. Okay, so going back to the parents selling them, for poor parents, they could actually get as much as $50, right? And then once the prostitute entered the United States, they would be resold for much more than that. Okay, so this was the tragic state of affairs for many Chinese prostitutes as slaves. Here is one quote from a Chinese prostitute at that time in the 1800s. Quote, I was kidnapped in China and brought over here. The man who kidnapped me sold me for $400 to a San Francisco slave dealer, and he sold me for $1,700. I had I had been a brothel slave ever since. I saw the money paid down. I'm telling the truth. I was deceived by the promise I was going to marry a rich and good husband, or I should never have come here. Unquote. Okay, so according to various studies, between 87 and 97% of the Chinese female population in San Francisco worked as prostitutes. I mean, it fluctuated, year by year, right? In fact, that was the high point was in 1860, and then 1870 we see somewhat of a decline to 72%, and then by 1880, and this is according to the U.S. Census, by the way, only 24% of the Chinese women in California were classified as prostitutes. By the way, what is the influence of this? And certainly extends even to 20th century with the last remaining Chinese women there. It was the influence of Protestant reformers, American Protestant reformers, going to places like Chinatown and trying to, convince the women and even slave sellers to stop what they're doing, even using legal methods. And basically, they were trying to reform them, right, from participating in this illicit uh, business. Okay, now moving on to indentured servants or the mutsai. Honestly, they're not that far from the reaches of prostitution because they're still domestic servants who are seen as slaves. Okay, but you can't say they were all in the sex trade. Rather, they're domestic servants in the more affluent Chinese homes or brothels, be that as it may, right? uh, in, let's say, San Francisco, right? So you have to think of them as really indentured servants working for families who have the economic wherewithal to purchase them, right? Okay, by the way, the Mutsai system was actually a cultural carryover from China. And it was generally regarded as a form of charity, at least initially, for impoverished girls. In fact, the term itself comes from, I think, a Cantonese dialect, and it means little sister, unquote. Mutsai means little sister. So this was an old tradition whereby, again, as I mentioned, the poor parent, right, the poor, impoverished parent, would sell the young daughter into domestic service. And, sometimes the parent would reason this way that, hey, life would be better for them as an indentured servant because at least they'll be given the basic necessities of life because the parents are so poor they could barely survive on their own. Okay, so again, it was seen as a sort of form of charity. Um, but in this system, the girl received no wages for her labor. Again, she's enslaved, practically speaking. She didn't have the liberty to leave on her own free will. She had no legal recourse for abuse. She couldn't complain, in other words, through the law or any formal channels. Again, this was supposed to be benevolent to the girl, but often what happens is, they became slaves. And at best, a Mutsai girl could hope to be married to a good provider eventually and then be freed. But at worst, they can be sold into prostitution. And, this practice, however, eventually vanished in the the Chinatowns of America. And again, it's due to the American Protestant missionaries who wanted to modernize Chinatowns, as I mentioned earlier. So these American reformers are also cracking down on the Mutsai system, besides the prostitution. Okay, now the third category are the wives and daughters of merchants. Now, this is the very narrow slice of the population of women migrants from China. Okay, we're talking the wives of male immigrants who are merchants, not the laborers, but the merchants. That is to say, they're entrepreneurs selling products to the Chinese there in the U.S. West. Okay, and they're considered the more higher status, obviously above Mutsai and Protestants. But at the same time, and this is determined by traditional culture, they're still considered traditionally the property of men, and they're constrained to lead these really circumscribed lives. Now, as it would happen, the merchant class in the Chinatowns at the time, well, because they have the wealth, right? They became the ruling elite. Um, and since many of the laboring class, the actual, manual laborers, they're unmarried, as we acknowledge. So the merchant class, they formed the basis of the growth of the Chinese American population and, the formation of a, quote, middle class, to use that term loosely, as applied to the Chinese. So the women in this situation were still not really free. And here you see this phrase here, triple oppression of earlier Asian women. Okay, and here you could even apply it to the wives of the merchants here. Okay, they were very reclusive. Well, they were expected to be reclusive, not really show themselves in public. This is the proper way to act for them. Even though they had mutsai to, provide them with service, they didn't do any housework. Therefore, they just sat around and they were expected to please their husbands, to have hobbies like needlework design, and just to confine themselves to the home. So, well, for us, today this is very boring, right? But nonetheless, for such women, they were of the elite class in China, and they were considered women of leisure. But as noted there, they're still subject to oppression. And what does triple oppression mean in this context? Here you have to think about the displaced um, Chinese women in the United States rather than their home country of China. Okay, so triple oppression relates to their oppression in terms of race, gender, and class. Okay, so race is obvious because they're the racial other, the racial minority, and Chinese were very oppressed. In terms of gender, I just described how tradition dictated that women, regardless of social class of China, were subservient to men. But then you think social class, you think that, hey, at least here they're not oppressed. That is to say, the wives of the merchants. In actual truth, they are oppressed in many ways because of tradition. And again, it's tradition, Confucian culture. There is a dictum that was adhered to by those who followed Confucianism. And here it is when it came to the role of women. And it goes something like this. As a daughter, obey your father. As a wife, obey your husband. And as a widow, obey your son. Okay, so that's the stages in life where women, even if they're from the higher classes, they're oppressed. So again, triple oppression, race, gender, class, even in terms of social class, even if they're higher up as merchant wives, they're still experiencing oppression, largely due to traditional norms of their home country.